Today we are in lesson 3.4 entitled A Storm and a Snake. Our focus verse for today is Acts 27, verses 23 through 25. For there stood by me this night the angel of God, whose I am and whom I serve, saying, Fear not, Paul, thou must be brought before Caesar, and lo, God hath given thee all them that sail with thee. Wherefore, sirs, be of good cheer, for I believe God that it shall be even as it was told me. And then our lesson text, where we'll take the majority of our lesson, is Acts chapter 27, that whole chapter, and then we'll go through Acts chapter 28, verse 5. Our truth about God for today is God will sustain us because of His plan. Thank God He has a plan. And then our truth for our life is I will trust God's plan. A question that we can start with today that we can ask ourselves is, recount a time God helped you keep calm while others around you were panicking. And we'll begin, before we get into the lesson, we'll begin with a story. Excuse me. 19th century Prussian Field Marshal Helmuth von Moltke, the elder, wrote, No plan of operations extends with certainty beyond the first encounter with the enemy's main strength. The former heavyweight boxing champion Mike Tyson said it a little less eloquently. Everyone has a plan until they get punched in the mouth. Over the years, Moltke's observation has been shortened to this: no plan survives first contact with the enemy. The history of warfare has repeatedly confirmed this. The Normandy invasion during World War II was one of the largest and most extensively planned military operations in history. It was overseen by some of the world's most brilliant strategists, including Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force, Dwight D. Eisenhower. But despite months of planning, the invasion encountered problems from the beginning. The attack was originally planned for May 1944, but was pushed to the following month due to a lack of landing craft. In June, the weather failed to cooperate. Allied troops were scheduled to make their historic landing on the beaches of Normandy, France, on June 5th. But Eisenhower was forced to call a delay of 24 hours. When the attack finally began shortly after midnight on June the 6th, cloud cover hindered visibility. As a result, the bombardment of the German positions by Allied aircraft did not cause as much damage as the Allies had hoped, which meant the troops landing on the beaches faced stronger than expected resistance. To complicate matters, some of the landing craft were blown off course. Partly because of their unexpected setbacks, these allies suffered approximately 10,000 casualties on the first day of the attack, while failing to achieve any of their planned objectives. By late June, the Allies had overcome these initial setbacks and achieved their objectives. You may not be planning anything as complicated as an invasion of Europe, but even simple plans are often frustrated by unexpected setbacks and the failure of others to cooperate. Perhaps that describes you today. You had your life planned out, but now here you are lying on this canvas flattened by the unexpected. Maybe it's a divorce. Maybe it's a terrible diagnosis. Maybe it's that your company is downsizing. Or maybe it's the death of someone you loved. King Solomon observed this in Proverbs chapter 16, verse 9, and this is the NLT version. We can make our plans, but the Lord determines our steps. We can make plans, but it's God that determines our steps. We need to trust Him and follow His plan wherever it is that He may lead. So our first point today is God's plan for Paul. And we've been talking about Paul a lot lately. Acts chapter 27 opens with the words, and when it was determined. So at this time, Paul was in custody of the Roman soldiers, and he was traveling by ship to stand trial in Rome. And that's kind of where we left off last Sunday. And I think I'd even said that I hope that we went into the storm because it was such a good story, and we are. We're going to go into the storm today of what Paul went through. Few things are as well ordered as soldiers and ships. Soldiers followed predetermined orders, and ships sail according to predetermined schedules. That's just how it works. Paul's life seemed to be mapped out for the foreseeable future. He was on his way to Rome, where he hoped that he would be granted the opportunity to preach the gospel to Caesar himself. The New Testament hints that Paul was the kind of person who saw value in planning and organization. He was responsible for overseeing churches and ministers in a lot of different cities and provinces, and that would have taken some degree of coordination, and he would have needed to be a planner and had some organization skills to be able to do that. He wrote letters sharing his plans with others, and we know that he was determined because he stuck to his plan to visit Jerusalem despite repeated warnings that it would not go well for him there. And you can find that in Acts chapter 21, verses 4 through 14. And that's where you will see those warnings of how it would not go well when he went to Jerusalem. In response to his friends' objectives, in Acts chapter 21, verse 13, he answers, "I am not ready to be bound only, but also to die at Jerusalem for the name of the Lord Jesus." So he was determined to accomplish his goal. Paul's friends earnestly tried to discourage him from continuing to Jerusalem, but he remained undeterred from fulfilling Christ's calling. See, when God calls us, it's just like a phone ringing. Until you answer that call, that phone can ring until you answer it. Nowadays you have voicemail, but it's just like that call of God. He calls us, and it's a continuous thing. He's always going to be calling us to something, and he's always calling us to more in him, to go deeper in him. Paul did not abandon his plans. He didn't let those warnings deter him. Neither the soldier nor the sailors who accompanied Paul and his companions anticipated that their carefully crafted schedules were about to be blown off course. And this is where we see the storm. Storm clouds were gathering on the horizon. The storm would shape events in ways that none of them expected. Our next point is God confirmed his plan to Paul through an angel. Paul was an experienced traveler. He'd been on a lot of ships, so he knew what he was doing. He had spent a lot of time aboard ships, and he was experienced in doing this. So he had undoubtedly acquired some knowledge along the way. The more you do something, the more you know about it. If you work in a field, whatever you're working in, the more you do it, the more familiar you become with it, and that was Paul. He sailed a lot, so he had become familiar with the knowledge of sailing those ships from those previous voyages. In 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 25, Paul notes that he had been shipwrecked 3 times. And let's read that. "Thrice was I beaten with rods, once I was stoned, thrice I suffered shipwreck, a night and a day I have been in the deep." So he's telling us in 2 Corinthians 11:25 that he had been shipwrecked 3 times. And we're not certain of the timeline of these incidents. The Apostle Paul may have endured more shipwrecks prior to Acts 27. We're not positive on that. So there could have been more endured shipwrecks prior to his voyage in Acts chapter 27. Consequently, though, Paul may have recognized this weather pattern that was happening, that weather pattern that was developing over the Mediterranean Sea, which may be why he issued the warning to the ship's officers. And you see this in Acts chapter 27, verse 10. He says, "Sirs, I perceive that this voyage will be with hurt and much damage, not only of the lading and ship, but also of our lives." The ship's captain and its owner ignored Paul's advice. So he was trying to give them some sound advice, but they ignored that, and they proceeded on with their travel because the weather forecast appeared favorable to them. They didn't think that there was anything wrong with going on. But I'm sure that Paul had some knowledge because he was able to say, I see this. I don't think that it's going to end well, but they wouldn't listen. When the south wind blew softly, they set sail for Phoenix, or Phoenix, a port on the coast of Crete, where they hoped that they would spend the winter. They hadn't sailed far when that soft wind mushroomed into a fierce storm. So they've not been on the boat long, and then here comes the storm. The ship and its passengers were exceedingly tossed with a tempest. So all that they should be saved was then taken away. So all the hope that they had of being saved was taken away at this point. Acts chapter 27, verses 18 through 20 is where you can find that. As the storm continued to drive the ship, the crew begins to lighten their load. They first cast out the cargo because, when you're in a storm and your boat's probably filling with water, the first thing to do would be get some of the excess off. So they lighten the load by casting off the cargo first. And then they follow that by casting off the spare tackling or gear or whatever that they were using. After nearly 2 weeks, the passengers and crew disheartened. So you can imagine how disheartening that would be. And they abandoned any hope for survival. Even if they were clinging on for hope, they didn't have it any longer. The sailors desperately began trying to save their ship and their own lives from destruction. Amid the chaos, God sent an unexpected vision. And that's just like God. He'll show up when we least expect it and give us that little ray of hope. So God sends an angel, and that angel aboards the ship with a message for Paul. And if you will look at Acts chapter 27, verse 24, which was part of our focus verse, it says, "Fear not." That's the angel talking, and she's calm, or he, the angel, says, "Thou must be brought before Caesar." So fear not, because Paul has to be brought before Caesar. Questions that we can ask ourselves is, has God ever given you a promise during a difficult time? Have you ever been facing something and God has just sent that little hope? And we've been talking several times here lately about how God's been dropping handfuls on purpose. It's just a little glimmer that God says, yeah, you're doing what I want you to do. You're on the right path. And that's what God did with Paul. He sent the angel to confirm, fear not, you got to be brought before Caesar. And then if God's ever given you a promise during that difficult time, how did that help you to endure? How did that help you to persevere? And when God speaks something in your life, whether it's by, a person that you trust or it's his word or whatever, write that down. Write that and the date down of when God spoke that to you so you can look back on it and you can say, God, you spoke this to me on this day, and I'm hanging on to this promise that you have given me. Search his promises in the Bible and, pray those promises. Our next point is Paul boldly testified of God's plan to the passengers. So Paul was reassured by the angel's promise that despite the appearance, everything was proceeding according to plan, which was God's plan. And so often things don't look like anything's happening. Have you ever felt that way? It doesn't look like anything's happening to our natural eye. But if we can look beyond that and see through Jesus' eyes and pray that he would let us, see beyond our circumstances. And that's what happened here, is this angel helped Paul to see that despite the appearance, that everything was going okay. It looked like it was bad. They were in a storm and everything was falling apart. But the angel reassures him that it's okay. It's God's plan. Everything's going to be okay. So Paul gathers his fellow shipmates and he shares this message with them. And he couldn't resist, I'm sure, saying, I told you so a little bit. Because you see in Acts chapter 27, verse 21, it says, "But after long abstinence, Paul stood forth in the midst of them and said, Sirs, ye should have hearkened unto me." So basically, you should have listened to me and not have loosed from Crete, and to have gained this form harm and loss. So he kind of starts out with, you should have listened to me. But Paul astounded them when he continued in Acts chapter 27, verse 22, and he says, "I exhort you to be of good cheer." So they're in a storm. It looks like they're going to die. It's going to go down. And then here's Paul telling them, be of good cheer. So it kind of seems like that, didn't even apply. But he could stand boldly and say that because the angel had reassured him of that. And he goes on to say, "For there shall be no loss of any man's life among you." So once they hear that, they can definitely be of good cheer, that they know that their life is going to be saved. No one on board may have felt that cheer, but those who knew Paul knew they could trust him. They knew that everything was going to be all right because they knew who he served. They knew the God that he served, and they knew they could trust him. In times of uncertainty and fear, the world needs to hear from those who have heard from God. It's so important, to listen when God speaks. It's so important to read his word. It's so important to have a pastor, that you can go to, that you can trust in. And if you will look at 2 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 4, it says, "Who comforteth us in all our tribulation, that we may be able to comfort them which are in any trouble, by the comfort wherewith we ourselves are comforted of God." So God comforts us, and then it's our job to comfort others. It's our job to share what we've been through so that we can be that, maybe your testimony is going to be a beacon of hope to someone else because maybe you've walked through what they're walking through right now. So in times of uncertainty, in times of fear, it's important for us to share what we've been through, to share who God is to us and how he's been there for us. Just like Paul, he is reassuring his shipmates that it's going to be okay. With this outlook, trials and tests can become opportunities for ministry, not reasons to despair. So when we go through things, it can be an open door for us to minister to someone else. So every person in here has a ministry. There's someone in your life that you can minister to, that you can share that good news of Jesus. With Paul, we can face the storm and declare to others. And this is in Acts chapter 27, verse 25. "Be of good cheer, for I believe God that it shall be even as it was told me." So we can be just like Paul. When we are in that storm, we're facing that storm that it looks like that we may go under. We can be like Paul and, be of good cheer. God has his hand on me. God's going to take care of me. A question that we can ask ourselves is, how can you comfort someone else today? Possibly in a similar way that you have been comforted. God is our comforter. So how has he comforted you that you could extend that to someone else? Our next point is, I will trust God's confirmed plan. So despite Paul's words of assurance here, his "be of good cheer, everything's going to be okay," the storm is still raging on. So what they can see with their visible eyes, that this storm is still going on. They're still in the storm of their life. He told the assembled crew in Acts chapter 27, verse 26, and this is the New King James Version, "We must run aground on a certain island." And then if you'll look at it in the King James, it's "Howbeit, we must be cast upon a certain island." So he's telling them, we're going to have to run aground. We're going to have to put this ship on the ground. And the danger of that, though, was the waves. Even though they may have took the ship to ground, run aground with it, there was a danger that went along with that. The danger was far from over because a ship that was run aground was vulnerable to that pounding of the waves. The waves, especially during that storm, were going to be violent, and then there was that risk of the ship breaking apart. And that's what eventually would happen, is that ship would break apart. But Paul trusted that God's plan and his promise would prevail over those immediate dangers that they were in. God could have allowed Paul to rebuke the storm. He could have allowed that through Jesus for Paul to have rebuked that storm and that storm to have ceased, just as Jesus did. Jesus, and we see that in Matthew 8, verses 23 through 27. We see that in Mark chapter 4, verses 35 through 41. And then we see that in Luke chapter 8, verses 22 through 25. So in three of the Gospels, we see Jesus rebuke the storm and cause it to be still. So God could have allowed Paul to have that same power through him, but he didn't. God chose to let Paul and his companions endure the storm. He chose to let them endure that, even though he provided that promise. He provided them with a promise from that angel that they would be safe, but they still had to walk through that storm. They still had to go through that. Paul and his fellow travelers undoubtedly would have preferred a quick rescue from danger. And that's like many of us today. We want to pray for just release or relief or just something quick. Lord, just get me out of this. Whatever it is you're going through, that's usually how we want to pray is, Lord, just get me out of it, whatever it is. But that wasn't God's plan here with Paul. He had to endure that storm. Even though God has all power and he can, rescue us at any point and any time, sometimes we have to go through things. Sometimes we have to ride out that storm. And that's what they did. They rode out the storm, confident that God would keep them safe. And just like I said, we want those quick solutions. We want those immediate resolutions to whatever our problem is. We like that mentality that you drive up to the window and you order and then you go pick it up and it doesn't take more than 15 minutes. And you don't want your storm to last more than 15 minutes because that's just how, it's human nature to feel that way. But a lot of times, and in many instances, God is going to allow you and myself to face storms. We will have to face storms in our life. The only way, though, that we can do that successfully, the only way that we can come out with our head above water once we get on the other side of that storm is to trust his process, to trust that he will prevail in the end and that he will see us through, that we will survive. Because there are storms that we go through, I know myself, that you think, Lord, that'll be it. This is it. This is going to take me out. But no, God has us in the palm of his hand. No matter what the enemy says, no matter how bad it may look, no matter the circumstances may look like that you have come up for your last breath, God has us in the palm of his hand. We will survive, but we have to hold on to him. If we let go of him, then no, we won't. We won't survive, but we have to hold on to God. We may run aground. We may be that ship that is sitting on the shore and the waves are pounding us, whatever your wave may be. They may be pounding us and you may think this is it. I'm so broken. I'll never survive. I'll never recover. But no, God is with us in every circumstance, no matter what it is, no matter how bad it looks. God is always with us. And he tells us he'd never leave us and he'll never forsake us. Another couple questions that we can ask ourselves is God calling you to ride out a particular storm? And you have to answer that as far as what your storm is. I don't know what storm you're facing. I don't know what trial that you're having to go through right now. But is God calling you to ride that out? I love that song, Ride Out Your Storm. It's an old one, and I've actually not heard it in a really long time, but I love that song about riding out your storm. And if God's calling you to ride out that storm, how can you demonstrate that? How can you demonstrate trust in him? That complete trust in him during that time. That, you and Jesus, I've heard that, before. Me and Jesus, we got it all worked out. But you need other people too. There are other people that can come along and help you. Just like with Moses when he was on the mountain, he had those that came along and they lifted his hands. You need those people in your life that it can encourage you. That's why you need a good circle of friends that they're going to lead you to Jesus, not away from Jesus and not, away from the house of God or anything else, but they're going to lead you to God. And when you're facing a storm and you're going through a trial, you've got those people that you can call on and say, I need prayer. And they will pray for you. They won't talk about you, but they'll pray for you. That's the circle that you need. And that's why it's so important to have that good group of people that you hang out with, that you associate with, that are leading you closer to Jesus, that are pushing you closer to Jesus. Our next point is a shipwreck and a snake bite. When danger threatens our safety, our survival skills instantly kick in. That's how God designed us. We've got survival skills. It's like we live on a one-lane holler. You meet somebody, it is automatically you're going to hit that brake. You don't even think about it. You just automatically slam that brake. You're on a one lane and you meet somebody. That's a survival skill that God has instincted us with. But, a lot of times when those survival instincts kick in, it's everybody for theirself or every man for theirself. And that often becomes our rally cry. We think, we're on this ship. Everybody's going to die. I've got to figure out how to save me. Let everybody else worry about them. But that's not how Jesus is, and that's not how he wants us to be. It's not every man for himself or every one for themselves. That's not the case, because we are to care for others. And, if we see our brother or sister down, don't push them farther. Lift them up, Be there to lift them up. And if, there comes godly correction, we've talked about this, and if you are under that godly correction, it doesn't feel good. But try not to get offended by it. Let that help you to propel forward toward God. Because if you have a pastor that he is godly and he is correcting you in some way, then thank God for him, because he is looking out for your soul. And I'd much rather John tell me something that I need to move up in and me make it to heaven than him just sit back and not say anything to me and let me pave my way to hell because he's not willing to stand up and because he doesn't want to hurt my feelings. I'd rather him hurt my feelings and me cry about it than me end up in hell and think, well, I wish he'd have told me. So that is so important. But this proved to be the case when they were on the ship that Paul was traveling. When it appeared that the ship was crushed by the rocks, the crew is preparing to escape. And you've got to remember, there's prisoners on here. Paul himself is a prisoner. There's prisoners on this ship. So in Acts 27, verse 31, we see that they lowered a lifeboat as they were going to lower the anchors. But Paul recognizes their true intentions. And he warns the centurion when he says, except these abide in the ship, you cannot be saved. So they're trying to, jump ship. If you don't abide in the ship, you're not going to be saved. And that's a word in itself. And that ship is Jesus. If you don't abide in him, then we're not going to be saved. We're not going to make it if we don't abide in him. While the crew members were only thinking of saving themselves, Paul was looking out for the good of all of them. Paul was a true apostle. He was a true apostle because a true man of God is going to look out for those around him. And that's what Paul was doing. He encouraged everyone to eat because they had been 2 weeks without food. So can you imagine 2 weeks without food and you're in the storm of your life? Some of us, if we go 1 meal without food, we're cranky. So can you imagine 2 weeks without food and you're in the storm of your life? And then, Paul says, be of good cheer. You're probably just not feeling it. But he tells them at this point, he says, you need to eat. He promised in Acts chapter 27, verse 34, there shall not an hair fall from the head of any of you. But he tells them to go ahead and eat. Having made this promise, he offered a prayer of thanksgiving, and then they began to eat. His attitude of calm assurance proved to be contagious, because Luke writes in Acts chapter 27, verse 36, then were they all of good cheer, and they also took some meat. Eating makes us feel better, doesn't it? Around here, we eat a lot. But, you think about our culture, when we celebrate something, what do? We eat. We have a dinner, and we eat a lot around here. So I guess we do a lot of celebrating. But they were hungry. So I'm sure that didn't help the situation. But Paul tells them that they need to eat. Some questions that we can ask ourselves is, are you currently enduring a crisis? And if so, how can you minister to someone who else is also in a crisis? I've never been through a tornado. But we see in London and in Somerset that they've went through these tornadoes, and it's so sad. Some families have lost everything, and nothing is salvageable. There's a couple that we know that they literally bulldozed their house because it was not salvageable at all. And it's so sad. And I've never been through that, so I couldn't minister to someone that had been through a tornado. But somebody that's been through a tornado, that's walked that before, could minister to those people. But, whatever it is that we go through, it's got a purpose. It has a purpose behind it. And whatever you're walking through right now has a purpose. And when you get on the other side of it, or it may be even right now while you're walking through it, God will use you in some way to minister to someone else if you'll allow Him and be open to what it is that He's asking you to do. Our next point is Paul survived a shipwreck just as God promised. As Paul warned, the ship ran aground and it began breaking apart from the crashing waves. Fearing that the prisoners on board would seize that opportunity to escape, some of the soldiers thought, well, we'll just kill them. We'll kill all the prisoners, and they won't be able to escape because they'll be dead. But the centurion wanted to save Paul's life. So he called off that mass execution. He was like, no, we're not going to do this. Before this fateful voyage, though, that centurion, he was the same one that ignored Paul's counsel when Paul, gave them the counsel that it wasn't a good idea. He had ignored that. But he had watched Paul remain calm. And he had watched that peace that was on Paul, and that more than likely, caused him to respect Paul. And it caused him to trust Paul and listen to him. So he wanted to save Paul's life. Ultimately, that was God. Ultimately, God had allowed that centurion to put off that mass execution. And, there was something special about Paul. Paul's one of my favorite characters in the Bible. I love to study him, and I've loved doing these Sunday school lessons because he was such an awesome man of God. But his past, he didn't, and I've said this before, he didn't let his past define him. He had a horrible past. He was probably one of the greatest sinners ever, too. But he didn't let that define him. Once he met Jesus, he literally did that 360, and he went full forward toward Jesus from that point. And I think it's just an amazing story. No one should ever say, well, I've done too much. Because Paul was a very wicked sinner. But, then he was an amazing apostle, an amazing man of God. So the soldiers heeded the centurion's orders, and Paul and the prisoners with him were spared. We do not always see that immediate benefit of faithfulness. You got to be faithful to God. That's what He's looking for is faithfulness. But when we trust God, it pays off in the long run. And Paul didn't see that immediately during this storm. He gave the counsel that he felt to give, but they didn't listen. Sometimes that happens. We give what God tells us to, but people don't listen. But we don't always see that immediate benefit of just being faithful. Every day you're showing up. You're serving the Lord every day. It's an everyday thing. You don't just do this on Sunday. You don't just do this on Wednesday night Bible study. It's every single day. You make a choice every single day to serve the Lord. And we don't always see that immediate benefit, but in the long run, we will. And if we never see it this side, we'll see it that side. And we'll see it when we enter in. And He says, well done, thou good and faithful. Faithful. There that is again. Thou good and faithful servant. That's what He's looking for. So many times we put all this stuff, that God wants this, that, and whatever. He wants you to be faithful to Him. He wants that relationship with you, that you are faithful to Him, that you serve Him every day, not just when it's easy, not just on Sunday mornings or Wednesday evenings, that you serve Him every single day. And more is riding on our response to adversity than just our own future. When you're faced with these adversities or these trials, these circumstances that are hard, our response can determine how things end up sometimes. And sometimes the enemy will roar, just like this storm was, and he will want you to lash back out. But if you can remain quiet and you can stand still and be faithful to God, even when nobody's watching, even when it seems like nobody even cares, you keep doing what God's called you to do. You keep being faithful. And in the end, you will see God will reward you. He will. Because of Paul's faith, 276 people were saved on this ship. There was 276 people aboard this ship, and they were all spared. It is doubtful that anyone on board that ship ever forgot who Paul was or the testimony of the God he served. So by Paul being faithful, just in the little things, then the ship was spared, or the people on the ship was broken, but the people were spared. What mattered was spared. And they knew the God that Paul served because it was a testimony. Okay, this God that he talks about kept him safe and saved all of us just because he was on the boat. So it's a testimony. And if we will be faithful and then share what God's done, don't let the enemy cause you to be silent. Don't let the enemy make you think that you can't make a difference. Don't let the enemy think that your voice doesn't matter, because it does. There's somebody in your life that you can minister to, somebody that's dependent on you. Paul's faith and trust in God's plan became a witness to those that were around him. And that's us. We're those witnesses. Our faith and our trust in God's plan can be a witness to all those that are around us. Our next point is Paul survived a snake bite because God was with him. Acts chapter 27, verse 44 opens with the beginning to a happy ending. And the rest, some on boards and some on broken pieces of the ship. And so it came to pass that they escaped all safe to land. So they didn't make it on the ship intact. They made it on boards and broken pieces. Hallelujah. I mean, to me, that's a word right there. Hallelujah. If we will just remain in Jesus, it doesn't matter what it looks like to other people. And don't ever judge someone else's worship because you don't know what they've been through. You don't know why they're worshiping the way they are. If they're loud and flamboyant, then praise God. If they're quiet and a crier, then praise God, whatever. However you worship, that's up to you. But never judge someone because maybe it doesn't look like the way you would worship, because we don't know what people's been through. And if you've been through a lot, then your worship's going to look different. Hallelujah. But that was not the end. So they make it safe to land. And then 3 verses later, we see disaster strike again. And this time, it's in the form of a venomous viper. Acts chapter 28, verse 3 says, "And when Paul had gathered a bundle of sticks and laid them on the fire, there came out a viper out of the heat and fastened on his hand." Paul was gathering sticks for a fire. What is ministry? It's serving. He was serving. He was building this fire, gathering these sticks to build this fire. He was serving. That's what ministry is. So often you think that it's the show. It's not. It's about, how can I serve? How can I be the hands and feet of Jesus? Here we see Paul. That's what he's doing. He's being the hands and feet because he's going out and getting sticks to build a fire to keep them warm. And when the heat from the flames caused this snake to lash out at the nearest living target, which happened to be Paul, that it latched on. So it bit him. Surviving a shipwreck only to be bitten by a poisonous snake would feel like the ultimate act of divine justice. He is a prisoner after all. He's still in prison. The natives of the island immediately assumed that Paul was a murderer, because they didn't know what the prisoners were in for. They weren't allowed to know that. But they only assumed that he was a murderer and that he was getting what he deserved. So when the snake latched onto him, they just immediately thought that he was getting what he deserved, because they didn't know what he had done. They watched and they waited because they were thinking, okay, Paul's going to drop dead. He'll be dead any moment. But once again, God had a plan. Paul shook off the viper, and he was unharmed. He remained unharmed. And if you go to Acts chapter 28, verse 5, it tells us, and he shook off the beast into the fire and felt no harm. So often you will hear that, people will take up snakes and they'll handle them. This right here was not what Paul was doing, and that's not God's word. He does not. That's tempting God. You don't go pick it up. He was out gathering sticks, and it came out and it bit him. But because Paul was a man of God, because he trusted in God, he was able to shake that off. You don't see Paul ever picking that up. That latched on him, and we have that same power, that if something comes and it's going to harm us, that we have that same power through Jesus, that it will not harm us. But we don't go and pick those things up and try to hold them or handle them, because that's just tempting the Lord. But if something comes at us, just like with Paul here, and it bit him and it was deadly and it could have ended his life, but it didn't, because God had a plan. And he was able to shake that off in the fire, and he remained unharmed. God used that disaster to bring revival to the island of Melita, which is where they had landed. They had landed on the island of Melita, and he used that to bring revival. Nothing could prevent Paul from reaching Rome, as the Lord had already assured him twice, in Acts chapter 23, verse 11, and in Acts chapter 27, verse 24. Our next point is, I believe God will sustain me because of his plan. Most of us would prefer to live the rest of our life without ever being in a shipwreck or ever being bit from a venomous viper. That would be, I would like to live the rest of my life without having to experience those things. For Paul, it was all in a day's work. Yet he trusted God that he would have the final say in all those circumstances. And when we allow God to call the shots in our lives, and then we face the unexpected, we can trust him. And we can expect to face it. When we allow God to lead us and guide us and him to call us, then we can face the unexpected. We're going to. We can also expect, though, that he's going to work everything for our good. Romans 8:28 says, and we know that all things work together for good to them that love God, to them who are the called according to his purpose. Who's called? All of us. We're all called. And he tells us here that we know that all things work together for good. If you love God, whatever you're going through is going to work for your good. No matter what it looks like right now, no matter how much the enemy's screaming at you or roaring at you or whatever it is you're going through, somehow, some way, he'll work that for our good. That verse proclaims the providence of God. Not only in our future is our future secure, but our present is also. So many times the enemy will make us worry about the future, and that takes our right now joy. So many times I have seen myself that way. He wants us to worry about what's going to happen tomorrow or next week or next month or next year, and that's taking my right now joy. I can't enjoy today because I'm worried about tomorrow. And the Bible's clear when it tells us to take no thought about tomorrow. So I don't even be thinking about tomorrow. I need to be, thinking about today and enjoying where God's got me right now. If God has future glory for us, and he does, then we know that our present, what we are right now, is in his hands. We are in his hands. And God knows how to work out these present circumstances that we are in, including suffering. Has anybody in here ever suffered? He knows how to work that for our ultimate good. God is in control of our lives, and he will not let our external circumstances thwart his ultimate plan for our life and his ultimate will. This verse doesn't mean, though, that and I'm still talking about Romans 8:28, this does not mean that we're always guaranteed positive results from every trial or tragedy, because we're going to go through some things. We might even lose some things. But God says somehow, some way, I'll work it for your good. All things. He doesn't say, just this or that. He says all things work together for good to them that love God. So after Paul shook off the snake in the fire, he suffered no harm. And the residents of Melita, though, they kind of got it mixed up. They changed their tune about Paul. In the beginning there, they thought that he was a murderer and he was surely going to die. But then they changed their tune and they start to worship Paul as a god. But of course, Paul, he's not going to accept that. He rejected their worship. And he prays for the father of a man named Publius. And God healed that man. And then God healed many that was on the island of Melita, and revival came there to the island of Melita. Only God can turn a shipwreck and a snake bite into an opportunity for miraculous healing. You know, if we will just trust God. Acts 28, verse 10. After a while, Paul and his traveling companions left Melita with everything they needed for the remainder of their journey. And in that verse, it tells us that they left with many honors. You know, we don't ask to be honored here. We don't want, any recognition when we're serving God. But sometimes he will, just like he did Paul here. Paul left with many honors because of what God had done through him. It wasn't Paul, it was God. And as I close here, the kids are coming in. More importantly, though, when they left this island of Melita, they had an increased confidence that the God who had saved them from a shipwreck and had delivered Paul from this venomous viper's bite would surely fulfill his purpose in them, and he would bring his plans to completion. So we can have that same faith. Questions that we are ending with is, has God ever turned a bad situation into something good? And the next thing is share that testimony with someone who is facing a similar situation. So whatever bad situation that you've been through, that God has turned that around and he's made it good, then share that testimony with someone else. And we won't have time for the story, but let's close in prayer. And our prayer focus for this week is for God to help us to trust him in the storm. So whatever storm we're facing, that God will help us to trust him. And that God would help us to encourage others who are enduring a storm. You know, if you're given the opportunity to encourage somebody that's going through something, do that. Walk through that door. If God opens a door for you to encourage someone, then do that. But as we close in prayer, let's all pray together.